This lecture will be the first of a few that we'll do in evolution and life history. And my goals by teaching this, there's some teachers that will, at Christian schools that will actually just skip this unit altogether. The reality is I think it's actually a very interesting unit to discuss. And my goals are quite simple. So the first one is for you to hopefully, better understand the theory of evolution. Many of you might actually think you know what the theory of evolution says, but unfortunately there's a lot of misconceptions out there, and so my goal is really for you to leave my class with a thorough understanding of what the theory says, what evidence seems to support that theory, and where Christians kind of disagree and agree on different things within that theory. I'm hoping also to answer any questions that you might have, things that you might be curious about. Hopefully, I'll be able to better equip you to decide what it is that you believe and be able to defend those beliefs in an articulate, informed way. Frankly, it doesn't really matter to me what you leave my class believing as long as you can defend those beliefs rationally. And then the last one that I need to make sure that I'm 100% clear about is I'm not going to tell you what I believe. It doesn't really matter what I believe for this unit. What is important is that I present the topic fairly. I'm going to try my best to do that, and hopefully it'll allow you to better understand what it is that you believe when it comes to origins. One thing that I'm going to try to do in this unit is I'm going to try to present the information fairly and give you different ways that both Christians and non-Christians interpret the information to support their particular worldview as far as origins. So here we are on planet Earth, and on planet Earth, scientists have identified roughly 2 million species already, categorized. That's plant and animal species. Scientists believe that there might be as many as 5 and 100 million species on planet Earth. The reason for that massive disparity is really kind of gets into the minutia of what do you define as a species, especially when it comes to the microscopic organisms like bacteria and whatnot. But clearly there's a lot of life on this planet, and all this life really demands an explanation. It seems to be an inherent part of the human experience all over the world to want to understand, why am I here? Why is there something instead of nothing? Why does this planet exist with all this life on it? Why do I exist? And why is there something rather than nothing? These kinds of questions. What happens to us when I die? Those kinds of questions seem to be just a natural part of the human experience. And so the big question of why am I here? Like, why is all this life here? Is a natural one that people wrestle with. Now, there's different answers to that question. And like I said, I'm going to try to, the way I look at it is I'm going to try to wear different hats in this unit. When I present information, I'll try to say, okay, now here's the information, here's the fact. Now, if I'm going to be a secular scientist, and really when I say secular scientist, I'm actually talking about kind of the fringe. Believe it or not, most scientists aren't atheists. Many of them are agnostic, meaning that they don't know, if God exists or not. But I'll try to kind of give you the hardcore atheist interpretation of the evidence. I'll also give you a young Earth creationist Christian kind of viewpoint, and I'll also try to give you more of an old Earth creationist kind of Christian viewpoint. So if I'm wearing the hat of an atheist is going to argue that the planet arose about 4.5 billion years ago as the result of all of the stellar processes that happened starting with the Big Bang. And then life, once the planet cooled to the point where life was possible on the planet, life arose quite by accident. The number that I believe that they're settling on right now is right about 2.5 billion years to maybe 3 billion years ago. The first life arose completely by accident, essentially just through chemistry. And then once that ancestral life appeared, that bacterial life, that it was able to evolve into all the different species we have today, and many millions more that have existed and gone extinct, like the dinosaurs and so forth. Now, Christians do have a very different explanation for the existence of life. We believe that living things were created by an intelligent creator, God. Now, how he created, though, Christians do disagree. Some Christians believe that life was created in a very short time recently, and other Christians actually accept huge chunks of evolution and do believe that, God used evolution as the creative mechanism. So we'll be looking at that. One thing I do want to point out, the very last page of your study guide, if you turn to it, what you'll see is a table of different Christian beliefs on origins. And I'd like to ask you to start thinking about, where would you put yourself? Where do you think makes the most sense as far as what you know now? And as we're going through this topic, to kind of maybe think about where you belong as far as what you believe on origins. One thing I like to do at the beginning of this unit is also throw out some quotes from some pretty influential thinkers on this topic. It helps give you an idea for the fact that there really is a very big diversity of opinion on this. So one quote from this professor, Soren Loftrup, is, "I believe that one day the Darwinian myth will be ranked the greatest deceit in the history of science." So clearly this is someone who not only does not believe in Darwinian evolution, but thinks that just the fact that it's even being perpetrated on people is a myth. Another quote, this is from a non-Christian. In fact, Richard Dawkins is kind of the classic held-up atheistic scientist, very hardcore atheist. And what he says is, so he's a biologist, "It's absolutely safe to say that if you meet someone who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked, but I'd rather not consider that." So obviously he's a hardcore believer in evolution and thinks the evidence is overwhelming. And so if you don't believe in it, you're either ignorant of the evidence, or you're just not very smart, or you're just not mentally all there. So obviously a very strong opinion on that topic. Another interesting one, though, is this quote. The quote says, "Nothing in biology makes sense except for in the light of evolution." And this is from this man. I'm not going to try to pronounce his name, and he's an evolutionary biologist. So clearly a strong believer in evolution. What's interesting about him, actually, is that he's a believer. He's Eastern Orthodox Christian. And that quote that I used there is not only a quote from him, but it's also a title of a paper that he wrote, essentially to the church, saying, hey, we need to embrace evolution because nothing in biology makes sense except for the light of evolution. And as Christians, we should be able to merge evolution with our faith. So realize that there are Christians that believe in evolution, and there's Christians that also reject evolution. Last quote for you is from another perspective. Ken Ham is a very, very famous young Earth creationist. He runs an organization called Answers in Genesis that you may have heard of. He's very, very anti-evolution, very into young Earth literal interpretation, Genesis 1. And his quotes in general are pretty anti-evolution, but this is an interesting one from him. It says, we're not saying that if you believe in evolution that you can't be a Christian, not at all. Because the Bible says that by grace you are saved. You don't save yourself. It is by confessing the Lord Jesus and that he was rose from the dead that you're saved. So Ken Ham, the reason I included this quote, like I said, he's a very young Earth creationist guy. But even he's willing to admit that I think most Christians would I'm hoping, would admit that this is not hopefully a salvation issue, because the reality is there's Christians that believe in evolution and Christians that don't, and that's not what saves you. But it's a very divisive topic, and so I threw some of those quotes in there so you can see that leading people on both sides of the issue have pretty strong words on it. And as we go through it, I'm hoping that you understand in more detail what this theory is and can better articulate what your beliefs are. So let's get right into the actual meat of the topic here. Remember that an organism has genes. We say it has a genotype. Remember, it can be homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive, or heterozygous. And it also has a phenotype, which is what does it look like. So it's got both the genotype, which are the genes that it's carrying around, and the phenotype, which are the expressions of the genes. Those are terms that we'll be seeing again in this unit. One thing I like to do in this unit is I like to try to give you some context for how Darwin got his ideas. In the time of Darwin, Christians generally accepted the idea of what was called fixity of species. And what fixity of species said was that every species that you see alive today, and that maybe anyone that was extinct in the past, those species were specially created by God, and they can't change. They don't change. It's impossible for them to change. They are fixed. And so every single species you encounter, God made them uniquely, exactly the way they are, and they can't change. It's impossible for them to change. Now, that idea was reasonably easy to accept initially, but then as scientists started going out into the wide world and discovering the diversity of life, that idea got a little bit more and more untenable, because you started seeing insects and you'd see beetles that were very, very similar, but were different species living in slightly different environments, in maybe the same forest, for example. And you started thinking, like, really, did God make all these different species exactly the way they are today? They didn't change at all. And again, it was mainly the insects that jumped people's attention to this when they saw just the diversity of insects that are out there, the diversity and yet the similarity. And the other thing was that people saw how humans were able to change dogs and the other agricultural crops, and they said, well, wait a minute, it appears that we're changing living things. So how could the fixity of species be correct? So it turns out that actually this is not correct, that the idea that species can't change, that's simply not correct. And I will give you a number of examples in this unit, whether it's bacteria becoming resistant to antibiotics, that's them changing, whether it's the fact that we have to keep changing the dog, flea, and tick medicine because the fleas adapt, they change to the treatment. There's lots of examples that I can give you of species changing in small ways. So fixity of species is not correct. And so the world that Darwin was working in, it was relatively easy to disprove that idea. The question that we're wrestling with even to this day is how much? How much can species change? One thing that's nice from my vantage point, having been around for a little while here and had this kind of conversation with lots of people, both Christians and non-Christians, one thing that I've noticed is a big difference between the two camps is that the way they define the terms gets problematic. And so I want you to write somewhere on your study guide that this is how sort of a scientist or somebody that accepts evolution defines micro and macroevolution. These are maybe the two most important terms in this unit. And here's the thing. Microevolution. Micro means small, macro means large. So microevolution is sort of small evolution. Now, the commonly accepted scientific definition for that term is changes that occur within a species. So it's still one species. It's not actually split to where they can't reproduce anymore, but they're changing. Macroevolution then is defined as changes that are actually sufficient enough to create a new species. And so you have one kind of bird, and then it requires enough differences to where now you actually have two different species of birds. That's the scientific definition for macroevolution. Now what's interesting is people that tend to reject evolution adopt these definitions, that microevolution is changes within a kind. So they're not talking about a species, but a kind, like a cat kind of organisms or a bird kind or things like that. And macroevolution is sort of the big changes that actually creates new kinds of organisms, not just new species, but new kinds. Now, I'm not going to tell you which of these two that you should accept. Honestly, you can work with either one of them, is fine. But the reason I point out these two differences is because what will end up happening is oftentimes in an argument between someone, let's say, that believes in evolution and someone that doesn't, is the person will provide, the person that believes in evolution will provide lots of examples, because we do have some examples of creating new species where you have one kind of fruit fly and then it changes into another species of fruit fly. But of course it's still a fruit fly, right? But it's a new variety of fruit fly, if you will. And they'll be giving those examples, and someone that doesn't believe in evolution will still be lumping what one person considers an example of macroevolution, the other person is viewing as, well, that's still just micro. It's still a fly. You're not showing me how that fly can turn to something really new, a new kind of organism. And so that's one thing I just want to kind of lay the groundwork for here, and we'll see as we look at these different types of evidences how different people will interpret that evidence based on, is it just making a new species? Is it evidence for a new kind? Things like that. So hopefully this if you can start to understand the difference in how people define their terms, it'll help you understand a lot more why it is that people can have long conversations and neither person really can change their mind on the topic. The remainder of this video is going to give you hopefully some groundwork as to what Darwin did in his lifetime, and how it helped to shape his beliefs and his opinion, his theory, his hypothesis of evolution. So Darwin, as a young man, kind of bounced around a little bit, didn't really know what he wanted to be, sort of when he grew up, and he kind of knew he didn't want to be a doctor because at the time being a doctor was pretty grotesque as far as the surgeries and things like that in the day. But what he found himself doing actually was his dad pulled some strings and was able to get him on the HMS Beagle. HMS stands for Her or His Majesty's ship, meaning that this was owned by the royal family, and his job was to be a naturalist. So what the king and queen would do is they'd take ships like this and they'd say, okay, hey, go out and explore the world and come back and tell us all about what you found, because then that would inform the government essentially. Well, maybe we should go to this area, and this is a place where we can get lots of timber, or here's a place where we can mine for this or that. Here's a good place to make a colony, and so forth. And so his job on this ship was to study nature. Look at geology, look at fossils and different living things, collect lots of specimens, and come back and tell the royal family all about it, essentially. Now, based on the observations that he made as a young man, he essentially went out on this voyage, collected all this stuff, and looked at the natural world and kind of started chewing on that idea. And then as an older man, he actually published his ideas in a book called On the Origin of Species, and that's where he proposed evolution via natural selection. So here is the voyage that Darwin went on the HMS Beagle. People don't realize, I don't think a lot of people realize it was a long trip, a 5-year voyage that they were at sea for. They left England, came down along South America to the Galapagos Islands, and then back. And most people really focus on the Galapagos Islands. It's very famous for what happened there, and Darwin's finches that live there, and all those sort of things. But what a lot of people don't realize is that his observations of what happened in South America first really made him start to think that this idea of the fixity of species, remember, that's the idea that the world kind of accepted at the time, that life can't change. His idea that maybe that was not correct, that life could change. And so what happened in South America was mostly he was looking at fossils. So there were paleontologists working in South America, and they were finding fossils like paleontologists do. And he was able to see some of them firsthand as he was just kind of exploring along South America. And some of the fossils were very interesting. So this one is the fossil of a giant extinct armadillo. So to give you some idea, that is the modern day armadillo that we have today. And these are people in the background to give you some idea for scale. And then here, you find these fossils of what looks a whole lot like an armadillo. The skeleton is basically identical. The only major difference is that one, is gigantic. And clearly, these giant armadillos don't live today. We would notice them. So Darwin's seeing these fossils of organisms that are clearly extinct, but are awfully similar to organisms that we have today. And he started to think, well, maybe as these species went extinct, maybe they left behind, remnants that changed into the modern day armadillo. That maybe, species can change. Same thing with the sloth. So this is sort of our modern 3-toed sloth, and then this is a sloth that we, paleontologists digging up in South America. Clearly a sloth. When you look at the rib cage and the way the arms and the hand bones look, very similar. The mouth, especially the skull. However, a little bit bigger. 9 feet tall, 550 pounds, that's the estimate. And so again, Darwin questioned, well, this sloth that doesn't exist anymore, it seems awfully similar to the modern day sloth. Maybe it just simply left behind smaller ancestors. It changed essentially over time, that while this one went extinct, maybe other sloths remained, and that's what we have today. So again, he started thinking that maybe species can change. This is how he first started thinking this, before he even got to the Galapagos. Then when he got to the Galapagos, now if we think about where the Galapagos Islands are, they are just west, about 600 miles west of South America. And so the beagle came down here and then went out to the Galapagos Islands. And what Darwin realized when he got to the Galapagos Islands, again, he was a naturalist, he was looking at the animals, he saw animals that were very similar to the animals that he just saw in South America, but weren't the same. So, he's down in South America, he's from England, so he's seeing animals in South America that are very different than the animals he sees in England. Then when he goes to the Galapagos, he finds animals that are awfully similar to South American animals, but a little bit different, a little twist, not quite the same. I'll give you some examples. So in South America, he saw lots of iguanas, and clearly these aren't found in England. So he's in South America, he's seeing these cool, large iguanas. Then he goes to the Galapagos, and he sees these iguanas, which we call marine iguanas, and they're clearly iguanas. They're very similar, but they're not the same. They're black instead of green. They're called marine iguanas. They're the only lizards that I'm aware of that actually basically make a living in the ocean. They swim out in the ocean and eat like algae and little plant matter that's under the water, in the salt water. So Darwin was intrigued by that. He said, that's interesting, that these animals are similar but not the same. And he started thinking, well, maybe one changed over time into another. Another very famous example of the difference between animals on the mainland and animals on the Galapagos. In South America, Darwin had seen these large tortoises, that were interesting and fairly good size, but they're on the mainland. And then when he got to the Galapagos, he found these really unique tortoises that were clearly tortoises, but just a little bit bigger. The giant Galapagos tortoises. And again, he started to think, well, that's interesting that we have these different species that are kind of unique to the islands, a little bit different than the ones on the mainland. And remember, he had just seen fossils that seemed to make him think that perhaps species can change over time. And so he started to think that maybe these species that are on the islands came from maybe species that were on the mainland and then have just changed over time to be similar, but still different from the ones on the mainland. So this is kind of where his thinking was going. He first saw the fossils, then he started to see these species on the islands that were different than the mainland. And then the really interesting thing happened was when he started to realize that even the species island to island were different from each other. So let's take a look at that. What he started to realize, too, was as he looked at these different organisms, he realized that the different islands, because the Galapagos is a small chain of islands, the islands each had different habitats, and so they all had kind of different varieties of similar species. And the classic one we think of is the finches, right? These small birds, these finches, on the different islands, but they all were subtly different in ways that seemed to allow them to survive. And the easiest way for him to notice was with the different food items. So you have, maybe on one island, you have lots of flowers. And so you've got finches that have beaks that are very good at getting nectar from flowers. On other islands, you might have, lots of places where you can get insects. So you can kind of dig the insects out of the bark of trees. And so you might get beaks that are very differently shaped. And on another island, maybe you have large seeds. And so you've got a beak shape that seems really good at getting the seeds out. Now, when you talk about evolution with somebody and you talk about Darwin, one of the first things I'm going to think about is like Darwin's finches. And it's because, the different birds on the different islands, have those different shaped beaks like I mentioned. But what a lot of people don't know actually is that what first drew Darwin's attention to the differences between the different organisms on the different islands was actually not the finches, these small birds, because their differences are rather subtle when you think about it, the beak shape. The first thing was the tortoises. The governor of the islands in the Galapagos informed Darwin that he could tell you which island a tortoise came from just by looking at its shell. And the reason why is because the shell shapes are very different based on what the tortoises are eating. See, some of their shell shapes are very kind of like we call saddleback. Other ones are more dome-shaped. Now, why would that be? Well, the saddleback shells allow for the tortoise to reach up much higher. And so on islands where there's not a lot of low vegetation, but lots of fruits and things that the tortoise can get to, the tortoises on that island have that shaped shell. On other islands where it's mostly grasses and low vegetation, the tortoise shells are much more that dome shape. They can't reach up high, but they don't need to reach up high. They can just reach down and feed on the grasses that are on the ground. And so Darwin started to think that maybe the actual environments of the island were shaping the shapes of the shell. That the way the shells were shaped was determined by what food sources were available to the tortoise, and the tortoises that could reach up on one island had an advantage, and the tortoises that could kind of very effectively reach down had an advantage on a different island. So we started to think that maybe it was actually the geography and the plants that were available, the food resources that were actually shaping the phenotypes of the organisms. And then only later on did he actually start to see that the beak shapes seemed to show the same kind of trend, that the finches on his way back from the Galapagos, as he was essentially trapped in a boat and nothing else to do, and he's looking at the samples he caught and that he killed essentially of these finches, he started to notice that the beaks shaped seemed to be related to what food resources were available on the islands that the birds came from. And that's what this picture is showing, that these finches have very different beaks based on the kind of food sources that they are eating, whether it's a cactus, or whether it's insects, or whether it's large seeds or smaller seeds. And Darwin realized that kind of on the way back as he was looking at his samples, that just like with the tortoise shells, it appeared that maybe the environment was actually shaping the shape of the beaks of the birds. So if you look at this picture and it says, describe the difference between the genotypes and the phenotypes of the birds. Well, let's start with the phenotypes. How are they different phenotypically? Well, remember, phenotype is how they look. Clearly, these birds are very similar, but the difference phenotypically is the shape of the beaks. Now let's think about genotypes. We can't see the genes, but what genes do you think are the most different between these birds? I'm hoping you're realizing that the genes that are probably the most different are the genes that are involved with building the beaks. Now, here's a question for you. In terms of the immediate survival of this bird today, getting enough food to survive today, what's more important to that bird? Its genotype or its phenotype? And why? Think about that for a second. I'm hoping you're realizing that it's the phenotype. It's the shape of the beak. Is that a good shape for surviving today or not? And so make a little note on your study guide, and we'll flesh this out later on in later videos, that natural selection is thought to act on phenotype. That it's the beaks that collect the food, and therefore natural selection is going to act on whether that's a good shaped beak or not. And then as a result, then you can change genotypes, but it's not acted on directly, that it's actually the phenotypes that are shaped directly. So that'll conclude this video. I hope that was helpful, and I'll see you next time.